Today, we get to do something very special. We get to start one of my absolute favorite books to teach. Now, it's not favorite because I really enjoy the darkness of night. It is my favorite because it elicits tremendous conversation in each of us and us as a class, us as individuals, for looking at this horrible time in human history and wondering how we can ever prevent something like this from happening again. The novel is called Night. We're going to cover this novel in important chunks of text. We're not going to end up reading the entire thing. I will put something on Canvas that if you are interested in reading the entirety of the novel, because it's not very long and it's very, very powerful, I'll put a separate section on Canvas for you to look at. But for right now, we're going to start off the novel at the beginning. We are going to skip down to page 6. So if you are scrolling on your canvas, you are going to see that I'm actually looking at page 14 of 73 because there is a preface and a foreword. You can skip through both of those. Those were written by other people about how wonderful this novel is. So we're going to skip down to where the novel actually begins. And this novel covers the story of a man who actually experienced the Holocaust. And he and his family were taken when he was 15 years old. He starts off the novel, though, not in 1944 when his family was taken. He starts off the novel earlier than that. And he starts it off by talking about somebody that you would not see as very important. He starts off the novel by talking about a man called Moshe the beetle, Moshe being Hebrew for Moses. And there's an individual named Moshe in his community. He is a homeless man. He cleans up around the Jewish synagogue, around their house of worship. And Ellie, who is your author, he gets to know him. And he starts that in 1941. He says he was almost 13. He was very into his faith. He would go to the synagogue every day and read and pray and think. He looked to, Eli looked to Moisha to be almost his spiritual leader, his spiritual guide. He asked his father, Eli asked his father if his dad would guide him. And dad said, mm-mm. Dad says, I'm running a store and this is going to be your job in the future. Dad was rather unsentimental, so he wasn't very emotional. And he really did not show his feelings here in the beginning of the novel. We're going to be looking, and there's a chart for you to kind of trace where father is in the beginning and where father and son are in the beginning. I would argue that their relationship is very businesslike at the beginning of this novel and throughout the beginning of his childhood. I would say that, dad was very interested in business and he was not really interested with his own family in the beginning. So their relationship would be more business. Father goes to work, son goes to school. That's about the extent of their relationship. Um, if you scan through, because we're going to scan through the beginning of this, he again turns to Moshe, who is a homeless man, but who is very knowledgeable about the Jewish faith. And when we get to page 6, where we're going to start, and then, one day, all foreign Jews were expelled from Saget, and Moshe the beetle was a foreigner. Now, he is in a country called Hungary. Hungary doesn't really exist anymore. It would be located to the south of Germany. And in 1941, when all the foreign Jews were kicked out of the country, Hungary was not technically under Nazi control, but everybody on the continent seemed to know their power. And when the Nazis came in and said, hey, we're going to take away all of your foreigners, the Hungarians went, okay. And it seemed to be a way to avoid any kind of unpleasant violence. So they stepped aside and the foreign Jews were taken away. Crammed into cattle cars by the Hungarian police, they cried silently. Standing on the station platform, we too were crying. The train disappeared over the horizon. All that was left was thick, dirty smoke. Behind me, someone said, sighing, what do you expect? That's war. The deportees were quickly forgotten. A few days after they left, it was rumored that they were in Galatia, working, and that they were even content with their fate. Now, if you were sitting on this side of history, you know at this time that if you're taken away in a train by the Nazis, that you were not working somewhere and okay with what happened to you. This right here was part of the Nazi war machine. They sent back rumors and propaganda so that the next time when they come to pick people up and take them away on trains, less people will fight them. They'll go, I heard it was going to be okay. Days went by, then weeks and months. Life was normal again. A calm, reassuring wind blew through our homes. The shopkeepers were doing good business. The students lived among their books, and the children played in the streets. One day, as I was about to enter the synagogue, I saw Moshe the beetle sitting on a bench near the entrance. This would have been very shocking. And this is the way that your author writes. He puts little pieces of information that could cause an explosion of meaning. He told me what had happened to him and his companions. The train with the deportees had crossed the Hungarian border and once in Polish territory had been taken over by the Gestapo. The train had stopped. The Jews were ordered to get off and onto waiting trucks. The trucks headed toward a forest. There, everybody was ordered to get out. They were forced to dig huge trenches. When they had finished their work, the men from the Gestapo began theirs. Without passion or haste, they shot their prisoners, who were forced to approach the trench one by one and offer their necks. Infants were tossed into the air and used as targets for the machine guns. This took place near the Galatian forest, near Colome. How had he, Moishe the beetle, been able to escape? By a miracle. He was wounded in the leg and left for dead. And I would pose this to you at this moment. I would say if a man was able to fake his own death and survive underneath the bodies of others who didn't make it for days, if he was able to survive that and then to crawl back into Hungary, back into this town, is it plausible that the same man could have gone in an opposite direction, found himself a boat, and gotten himself off the continent? Yeah, but you know why he went back. He had friends there. He wanted to warn them. Day after day, night after night, he went from one Jewish house to the next, telling his story and that of Malka, the young girl who lay dying for 3 days, and that of Toby, the tailor who begged to die before his sons were killed. Moishe was not the same. The joy in his eyes was gone. He no longer sang. He no longer mentioned God or Kabbalah. He spoke only of what he had seen. But people not only refused to believe his tales, they refused to listen. Some even insinuated that he only wanted their pity, that he was imagining things. Others flatly said he had gone mad. As for Musha, he wept and pleaded, "Just listen to me. That's all I ask of you. No money, no pity. Just listen to me." He kept shouting in synagogue between the prayer at dusk and the evening prayer. Even I did not believe him. I often sat with him after services and listened to his tales, trying to understand his grief, but all I felt was pity. "They think I'm mad," he whispered, and tears like drops of wax flowed from his eyes. Once I asked him the question, "Why do you want people to believe you so much? In your place, I would not care whether they believed me or not." He closed his eyes as if to escape time. "You don't understand," he said in despair. "You cannot understand. I was saved miraculously. I succeeded in coming back. Where did I get my strength? I wanted to return to Siget to describe to you my death, so that you might ready yourselves while there is still time. Life? I no longer care to live. I am alone, but I wanted to come back to warn you. Only no one is listening to me." This was toward the end of 1942. Oh, goodness. Okay, a couple of things. At the end of 1942, the Americans had already gotten involved in World War II. You remember Pearl Harbor? That happened December 7th of 1941. So there is a massive war raging on the rest of this continent. But the people in Hungary, because they had not yet been invaded, were kind of living in this special zone where they felt like they were safe from the rest of the atrocities happening in the world. When Moishe comes back and tells them what happened, the people absolutely do not believe him, and they absolutely do not want to listen on top of that. When we hear this, we can shake our heads and go, "My God, that is awful," but we are also on this side of history, and we know what is waiting for all of these people. They didn't. They had no idea that somebody had conceived of this kind of evil. Now, Moisha is homeless. Perhaps, maybe, if somebody else who was of higher esteem, even Ellie's father, if he had gone through this and come home and come back and told them this, maybe they would have listened, maybe they would have taken action. But right now, this is too horrifying to buy into, and they don't, and they won't. 1942. Thereafter, life seemed normal once again. London radio, which we listened to every evening, announced encouraging news: the daily bombings of Germany and Stalingrad, the preparation for the Second Front. And so we, the Jews of Saget, waited for better days that surely were soon to come. I continued to devote myself to my studies, Talmud during the day and Kabbalah at night. My father took care of his business in the community. My grandfather came to spend Rosh Hashanah with us so as to attend the services of the celebrated Rabbi of Bush. My mother was beginning to think it was high time to find an appropriate match for Hilda, one of his older sisters. Thus passed the year 1943. Now, guys, as you're reading, again, we're on this side of history, and you can know that World War II in Europe is going to end in April of 1945. That's what we're waiting for, April of 45. And now we are looking at spring of 1944. 1 year. Splendid news from the Russian front. There could no longer be any doubt. Germany would be defeated. It was only a matter of time, months or weeks perhaps. The trees were in bloom. It was a year like so many others with its spring, its engagements, its weddings, and its births. The people were saying, "The Red Army," that's Russia, "is advancing with giant strides. Hitler will not be able to harm us, even if he wants to." Yes, we even doubted his resolve to exterminate us, annihilate an entire people, wipe out a population dispersed throughout so many nations, so many millions of people. By what means? In the middle of the 20th century. I mean, truly, it's ridiculous that this is going on, but they absolutely will not acknowledge it. And thus my elders concern themselves with all manner of things: strategy, diplomacy, politics, and Zionism, but not with their own fate. Even Moishe the beetle had fallen silent. He was weary of talking. He would drift through synagogue or through the streets, hunched over, eyes cast down, avoiding people's gaze. In those days, it was still possible to buy immigration certificates to Palestine. I had asked my father to sell everything, to liquidate everything, and to leave. "I am too old, my son," he answered. "Too old to start a new life, too old to start from scratch in some distant land." Now, Palestine today is Israel. Palestine was turned into the country of Israel after this whole debacle. And it was kind of created as I really hate that you guys had to go through this. Here is your own place. And because the outside world turned a place like Palestine, which was considerably full of Muslims at the time, and decided that now belonged to another group of people, and you put a number of Jewish people together, that perhaps explains why there has been so much fighting your entire life, my entire life, but like on the Gaza Strip, there's been so much fighting because these areas were not naturally created. This was something that the world just said, and poof, here you go. Question: if Ellie asked his father to sell everything, to get off the continent, and to go, even though he said originally that he did not believe what Moishe had said, if he's asking his father to go, some part of him does believe that there's truth to it. But Dad says, "Mm-mm, I'm too old." You'll see his age in chapter 3. And then this interesting thing happens. Budapest radio announced the fascist party had seized power. The regent, Miklos Horthy, was forced to ask a leader of the pro-Nazi Nihilist party to form a new government. That is the equivalent of turning on CNN or Fox News or ABC tonight and just like, poof, hey, you've got a new president and there wasn't an election. Handle it. That's the equivalent of what he just said. Yet we still were not worried. Of course, we had heard of the fascists, but it was all in the abstract. It meant nothing more to us than a change of ministry. The next day brought really disquieting news. German troops had penetrated Hungarian territory with the government's approval. Finally, people began to worry in earnest. One of my friends, Moishe Haim Berkowitz, returned from the capital for Passover and told us the Jews of Budapest, that's the capital of Hungary, live in an atmosphere of fear and terror. Anti Semitic or anti Jewish acts take place every day in the streets, on the trains. The fascists attack Jewish stores, synagogues. The situation is becoming very serious. The news spread through Saget like wildfire. Soon that was all people talked about, but not for long. Optimism, optimism soon revived. The Germans will not come this far. They will stay in Budapest for strategic reasons, for political reasons. In less than 3 days, German army vehicles made their appearance on our streets. They still did not believe it was going to affect them because they lived in a small town. But alas, anguish. German soldiers, with their steel helmets and their death's head emblem. Still, our first impressions of the Germans were rather reassuring. The officers were billeted, that means they're housed, in private homes, even in Jewish homes. As in, their town was so small they didn't have hotels. So you just magically had soldiers showing up and sleeping in your house. Their attitude toward their host was distant but polite. They never demanded the impossible, made no offensive remarks, and sometimes even smiled at the lady of the house. A German officer lodged in the Khan's house across the street from us. We were told he was a charming man, calm, likable, polite. 3 days after he moved in, he brought Mrs. Khan a box of chocolates. The optimists were jubilant. Well, what did we tell you? You wouldn't believe us. There they are, your Germans. What do you say now? Where is their famous cruelty? The Germans were already in our town. The fascists were already in power. The verdict was already out, and the Jews of Saget were still smiling. And let me give you a little bit of background here. When those Germans, there would be very, very few that entered this teeny tiny town. When those Germans showed up, they were part of a group called the Einsatzgruppen. That's the killing squads. And those people would come in and they would spend a few days looking through the area. They would go to hospitals, they would go to synagogues, they would talk to people. And what they were doing was compiling a list of names, all of the people who were Jewish in that town. They were compiling a list of names. So while the people of Saget, who were refusing to believe what was happening around them, while they had their heads in the sand, the people living in their homes were writing their death certificates. The 8 days of Passover. The weather was sublime. My mother was busy in the kitchen. The synagogues were no longer open. People gathered in private homes. No need to provoke the Germans. Almost every rabbi's home became a house of prayer. We drank, we ate, we sang. The Bible commands us to rejoice during the 8 days of celebration, but our hearts were not in it. We wished the holiday would end so as not to have to pretend. On the seventh day of Passover, the curtain finally rose. The Germans arrested the leaders of the Jewish community. From that moment on, everything happened very quickly. The race toward death had begun. First edict. Jews were prohibited from leaving their residences for 3 days under penalty of death. Moishe the beetle came running to our house. I warned you, he shouted, and left without waiting for a response. The same day, the Hungarian police burst into every Jewish home in town. A Jew was henceforth forbidden to own gold, jewelry, or any valuables. Everything had to be handed over to the authorities under penalty of death. My father went down to the cellar and buried our savings. As for my mother, she went on tending to the many chores in the house. Sometimes she would stop and gaze at us in silence. 3 days later, a new decree. Every Jew had to wear the yellow star. Some prominent members of the community came to consult with my father, who had connections at the upper levels of the Hungarian police. They wanted to know what he thought of the situation. My father's view is that it was not all bleak, or perhaps he just did not want to discourage the others to throw salt on their wounds. The yellow star. So what? It's not lethal. Poor father. Of what then did you die? But new edicts were already being issued. We no longer had the right to frequent restaurants or cafes, to travel by rail, to attend synagogue, to be on the streets after 6 o'clock in the evening. Then came the ghettos. Couple of things. One, I would like for you to notice that everything is happening very much according to a script. And everything that is happening in this particular section is meant to both physically and psychologically break the people in this town, specifically the Jewish people in this town. Passover is a holiday that the Jewish people celebrate about the freedom when the Jewish people left Egypt. They were now free. There was a story in this book, and it's called the Bible, in which there were many, many plagues, and then Moses led the people away from Egypt because they had been enslaved there. Um, they were free. That's why, very specifically and very psychologically damaging, they almost locked down and put them back in prison here at the last day of the Passover. When we skip over and we look at the yellow star, Ellie's little quote here, poor father, of what then did you die? You're not reading this story or this experience as Ellie is experiencing it. He did not write this story until 10 years after he had experienced it. So everything that he's writing to you, he is choosing the most important moments and then he's writing them. In this particular moment, he says, poor father, of what then did you die? That little piece of cloth that they had to attach to their clothing to denote them as Jews, it didn't have poison in them and it wasn't going to kill them. But that star labeled them and it put a target on their bodies. Two ghettos were created in Saget. A large one in the center of town occupied 4 streets, and another smaller one extended over several alleyways on the outskirts of town. The street we lived on, Serpent Street, was in the first ghetto. We therefore could remain in our house. But as it occupied a corner, the windows facing the street outside the ghetto had to be sealed. We gave some of our rooms to relatives who had been driven out of their homes. Little by little, life returned to normal. He does put normal inside of quotation marks this time, though. The barbed wire that encircled us like a wall did not fill us with real fear. In fact, we felt this was not a bad thing. We were entirely among ourselves, a small Jewish republic. A Jewish council was appointed, as well as a Jewish police force, a welfare agency, a labor committee, a health agency, a whole governmental apparatus. People thought this was a good thing. We would no longer have to look at all those hostile faces, endure those hate filled stares. No more fear, no more anguish. We would live among Jews, among brothers. Of course, there were still some unpleasant moments. Every day, the Germans came looking for men to load coal into the military trains. Volunteers for this kind of work were few. But apart from that, the atmosphere was oddly peaceful and reassuring. Most people thought that we would remain in the ghetto until the end of the war, until the arrival of the Red Army, the Russians. Afterward, everything would be as before. The ghetto was ruled by neither German nor Jew. It was ruled by delusion, as in they were lying to themselves, and they knew it. The reason that they created what they called ghettos, they were putting all the Jewish people into one tiny location, kind of like a prison, so that it would be easier to keep an eye on them. And as far as boarding up the outside windows goes, that's all the better so that the people inside could not see what was happening as they were gathering trains, as they were gathering vehicles, what was happening outside the gates. All right. Wiesel might have started a little bit slowly talking about Moshe and his faith, but the moment the Nazis come into the ghettos, things are going to move very, very quickly. And that's the way the rest of the novel is going to go. All right, guys, we will talk more about this novel tomorrow.